What does mercy smell like in wartime? In Texas, 1945, it drifted over barbed wire and sunburnt fields, smoke, mesquite, and sizzling meat. German women prisoners lifted their heads, caught between disbelief and hunger, as the scent of barbecue blurred every lesson they had been taught about the enemy. Hans Müller, once a sergeant in the Afrika Korps, clutched his tin cup and wrote in his small diary that evening, "It was not propaganda films. It was not a staged illusion. I smelled it. I saw it. They roasted beef larger than artillery shells. Why would they do this for us?" To understand his astonishment, one must first rewind the clock. 2 years earlier, in the dust of Tunisia, surrender had meant humiliation. Nearly 275,000 Axis troops, German and Italian alike, laid down their arms. The once proud formations of Rommel's vaunted army shuffled into captivity, gaunt, exhausted, and convinced the worst lay ahead. Rumors spread quickly among the ranks. They would be shot, starved, or worked until collapse. "At best," one man muttered on the truck to the coast, "they will grind us into the desert." Instead, the captives were herded onto Liberty ships. Vessels built at an astonishing pace, one every 3 days, by an America whose industrial might was only beginning to reveal itself. Below decks, the men found bunks crammed tight, the smell of salt water seeping through hatches. Sweat, wool, and seasickness mingled in the darkness. Guards with carbines paced the aisles, yet their discipline was oddly casual. They passed out cigarettes, spoke of baseball back home, and made jokes the prisoners could barely understand. The food shocked them most. Even at sea, trays appeared with white bread, butter, and meat. "On the ship, I ate better than in the field," Hans later recorded, astonished. His comrades whispered in disbelief. Was this generosity a trap? Above, the convoy steamed across the Atlantic, destroyers prowling the edges while depth charges thudded into the deep. Every explosion reminded the prisoners their lives now depended on the very navy that had once been their sworn enemy. One recalled, "The sound of mess trays was America to me. It meant food. It meant life." What unfolded on those ships was the first paradox, the first crack in the wall of propaganda that had promised Americans were decadent, starving, hollow. In the cramped dark, with every clang of steel trays, the prisoners realized something their commanders had never admitted. The enemy was not weak. The enemy was stronger than they had ever imagined. And yet, the true revelation still lay ahead. Beyond the Atlantic, waited Norfolk, Virginia, its cranes rising like giants, its docks stacked with goods untouched by bombing. For the men of the Afrika Korps, stepping onto that soil would be like walking into another world. The whistle of the locomotive echoed through the Virginia harbor, mingling with the creak of cranes and the cries of longshoremen. When the German prisoners stepped off the Liberty ships at Norfolk in June 1943, the first shock was visual. No rubble, no shattered glass, no ruins clawing at the skyline. Instead, warehouses towered in neat rows, railcars waited in lines that seemed endless, and goods, fruit, grain, machinery were stacked in such profusion that it looked more like the backdrop of an industrial fair than a nation at war. Dr. Wilhelm Hoffmann, a camp physician conscripted from Hamburg, squinted into the light. He expected humiliation in this new land, a forced march, perhaps jeers from civilians. What he encountered instead was something far stranger: efficiency. Soldiers with clipboards moved the lines of prisoners. Red Cross officers waited with papers. Doctors in crisp uniforms checked teeth, lungs, and blood pressure. Hoffmann braced himself for mockery. Instead, one American medic muttered, "Low weight, malnourished, needs vitamins." The data confirmed it. Records from Norfolk show that nearly 1 in 5 prisoners arrived undernourished. The average German captive weighed between 25 and 30 pounds less than expected. Night blindness, bleeding gums, skin rashes, symptoms of vitamin deficiencies were so common that the U.S. Army quietly noted them as a medical concern. "We had thought ourselves the elite of Europe," Hoffmann later wrote, "but in their hands we became specimens of hunger." Then came the food. Not crusts, not ersatz grains, but hot meals. Scrambled eggs, steaming beside fried potatoes. Beef stew ladled in thick portions. Coffee, real coffee, dark and fragrant, flowing in metal pitchers by the gallon. For men accustomed to roasted acorns and watery substitutes, the aroma alone was intoxicating. One corporal from Bremen muttered into his diary, "We thought it was theater. That cameras would come, and then the food would be taken away." But no one came. The food remained. For Sergeant Joe Ramirez, a 22-year-old guard from Kansas, it was just another day's duty. Yet he saw the expressions on the prisoners' faces as they ate in silence, eyes darting with disbelief. They looked like men betrayed, he later recalled. Not by us, but by the lies they'd been told. The psychological impact was profound. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a collapsing giant, a land of breadlines and riots, unable to feed its own. Yet here, in their first days on American soil, German soldiers laughed nervously as they swallowed mouthfuls of beef and butter. Within weeks, reports noted, average prisoner weight increased by 10 to 12 pounds. The irony was cruel. Men captured as enemies were eating better than their own families back in Germany. And Norfolk was only the beginning. Ahead lay the long train rides, inland journeys through orchards, fields, and towns untouched by war, where even children seemed to live in abundance. For the prisoners, it would be the next, and perhaps the deepest, crack in the wall of illusion. The train wheels clattered rhythmically as they carried their human cargo inland. From barred windows, the German prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, staring in silence at the unfolding panorama of America. The Shenandoah Valley rolled past in a blur of orchards heavy with apples, barns painted bright red, and fields of alfalfa swaying green in the summer wind. For men who had left behind smoldering cities and cratered streets, the sight felt almost like a hallucination. Hans Muller wrote in his diary, "Not a ruin, not a crater, children playing on sidewalks, roofs intact. How can this be? Do they not know there is a war?" At every crossing, townsfolk gathered. Women with baskets, children in overalls, even farmers in straw hats waved as the train thundered by. Some ran alongside, tossing sticks of gum or even chocolate through the bars. A corporal from Cologne bent down to pick up a Hershey bar and stared at it for minutes before unwrapping it. "I had not seen chocolate in years," he recalled. "A child gave me two. I felt ashamed. The sensory onslaught was overwhelming. The smell of orchards and fresh hay drifted in through open slats. The whistle of the locomotive cut through valleys like a herald's call. At night, the rhythm of the tracks became a lullaby that masked a deeper disquiet. The realization that America was not only surviving the war, it was thriving." For Eleanor Price, a Red Cross volunteer writing letters to her brother fighting in France, the spectacle was different. She described seeing the trains roll past her small Virginia town. "They are enemy soldiers, yes," she wrote, "but they looked so young and so tired. I could not help but think, their mothers must worry as I do." Her words echoed the quiet compassion many civilians felt, even in wartime. As the trains rumbled further south and west, the abundance only grew more obvious. Fields stretched to the horizon, corn stalks waving like banners. Grain elevators rose like towers, freight trains thundered by laden with supplies. In Kansas and Oklahoma, cattle dotted pastures so vast, they seemed endless. To prisoners used to ration cards and scarcity, the sheer scale of production was crushing. One whispered to another, "If they can feed all this and fight across the world, how can we ever win?" By late summer of 1943, many of those trains converged in Texas. There, under the punishing sun, entire towns of wood, wire, and watchtowers had risen almost overnight. Camp Swift, near Bastrop, completed in mere months, sprawled across thousands of acres. Rows of barracks, kitchens, workshops, and even hospitals stood ready. For the Germans, stepping off the train into Camp Swift was like entering a paradox. Captivity, wrapped in comfort. Hot water from taps, electric lights glowing after dark, flush toilets, stoves for winter, and fans for summer luxuries they had not known, even in their own barracks back home. It was as if we had entered a modern world that we were told did not exist, Hans confessed. Behind barbed wire, but within walls that offered dignity. The Germans began to wonder, had they been lied to their whole lives? The answer would come in the form of smoke, song, and sizzling meat on an American holiday that meant nothing to them, but would change everything. The Texas sun hung high and merciless, bleaching the sky to a pale white. Cicadas whined from the mesquite trees, their chorus broken only by the sharp pop of firecrackers. It was July 4th, 1944, Independence Day in America. To the men behind the wire at Camp Swift, it was just another day of captivity. Yet by late afternoon, guards began marching them toward an open field, where smoke already curled in lazy ribbons. The Germans squinted, shielding their eyes. Then, the smell hit them. Hickory and mesquite, sweet and sharp, carrying the unmistakable weight of roasting meat. Rows of shallow pits had been dug into the earth, each glowing red with coals. Over them lay massive cuts of beef, briskets the size of helmets, hissing and dripping fat that sent sparks into the air. The aroma was dizzying. Pepper, paprika, garlic, brown sugar, all mingling in a haze of smoke. A rancher named Buck Morrison, his broad shoulders darkened by sun, lifted the lid on a steel smoker and held up a slab of meat, its bark crisp, its smoke ring glowing pink. 12 hours, he said, chuckling to the guards and prisoners alike. Slow and steady. That's the way. Hans Muller whispered to his neighbor. No one cooks meat for prisoners. Yet here it was. The tables were piled high with trays of cornbread, beans simmered in molasses, potatoes split open with butter melting into the flesh. Glass bottles of Coca-Cola hissed as caps popped off, fizzing in the heat. Children from nearby Bastrop darted between tables, offering drinks, laughing, and most astonishing of all, passing plates of food through the invisible barrier between captor and captive. A teenage girl shyly offered a slice of peach cobbler to a stunned German sergeant. He wrote later in his journal, "I thought of my sister queuing for bread in Hanover. Here they give dessert to the enemy." Then, the music began. Fiddles and guitars struck up country tunes, a harmonica's wail rising into the dusk. Prisoners clapped hesitantly, some smiling despite themselves, others turning away, too proud or ashamed to show feeling. Above, fireworks burst in red and gold, echoing across the prairie. For the first time, many Germans felt the paradox in its purest form. They were captives, yet treated like guests at a feast. Dr. Hoffman, the camp physician, put it in plain words. In Germany, civilians received 2 pounds of meat a week, often less. Tonight, each man was given more than his family would see in a month. This is not propaganda. This is life, and it destroys everything we were told. That night, as smoke still clung to their life, clothes, and the echo of fiddles drifted through the barracks, the prisoners lay awake, restless with a fullness they had not known in years. One corporal wrote, "We killed their sons, and yet they give us meat. I cannot understand this country." The barbecue was a spectacle, yes, but its power lay deeper. For the prisoners, it was not just a meal, it was a revelation that abundance itself could be a weapon, one stronger than bullets or bombs. The clang of mess hall bells broke the dawn each morning at Camp Swift. Prisoners filed into long wooden halls where steam rose from trays of scrambled eggs, fried potatoes, and bacon. The smell of coffee, real, dark, plentiful, hung in the air. For men raised on bitter substitutes of roasted barley or acorns, the first sip was intoxicating. Hans Muller confessed in his diary, "To drink coffee every morning. Even our generals did not have this." Lunch and supper carried the same paradox. Beef stew thick with vegetables. Fried chicken, with batter crisp and golden. White bread so soft it crumbled in the hand. Pies filled with cherries, apples, or pumpkin, depending on the season. Even peanut butter, strange, sticky, sweet, became an object of fascination. At first, the Germans sneered. Within weeks, they scraped jars clean. But abundance was not measured in food alone. The Geneva Convention entitled prisoners to compensation for their labor, and in American camps this meant canteen tokens redeemable for goods. Cigarettes, candy bars, soap, shaving cream, even bottles of Coca-Cola chilled in ice boxes. A sergeant from Bavaria wrote, "I sat beneath a tree, drinking Coca-Cola, listening to a radio. How can this be captivity? The numbers behind this generosity were staggering. U.S. Army records show prisoners received nearly the same rations as American soldiers, about 3,500 calories per day. In Germany, civilian rations had fallen to 1,500 calories or less by 1944, while German families queued for hours to buy a few ounces of butter. Prisoners in Texas spread it thick across slices of bread without thought. Eleanor Price, the Red Cross volunteer, described the contrast in a letter home. "We hear from Europe that children faint from hunger in school. And yet here, even the enemy eats pies and drinks milk. It is difficult to reconcile, but perhaps it is right. Perhaps this is how peace is built." Camp life also offered something unexpected: dignity. The prisoners could walk fields within the wire, tend gardens, even organize soccer matches. Libraries carried both German classics and American novels. Film nights screened westerns and comedies, carefully chosen to avoid offense. Music drifted from gramophones, swing records, church choirs, even prisoner orchestras that rehearsed in dusty barracks. Sergeant Joe Ramirez remembered one evening standing by the wire as a group of Germans played Beethoven on violins. "It was strange," he said later. "I was guarding men who had fought against us, but the music made them just men again. For a few minutes, it felt like there was no war." Yet, beneath the abundance, a deeper unease gnawed at many prisoners. They laughed as they ate, but fell silent afterward, unsure how to process what they were experiencing. The contradiction was too great. In captivity, they lived better than their wives and children back home in Germany. One letter, censored but preserved, put it bluntly: "If this is their ordinary life, then we have been lied to more deeply than we ever imagined." And still, the most shattering revelations waited beyond the camp fences in American towns where ordinary prosperity unfolded in plain view. The growl of truck engines cut through the morning air as German prisoners climbed into flatbeds, rifles slung loosely in the hands of American guards. By mid-1944, thousands were being sent beyond the barbed wire to work, harvesting wheat in Nebraska, felling timber in Arkansas, picking cotton under the punishing Texas Sunday. To the prisoners, the shock was not only that they were trusted outside the fences, but what they saw on those journeys. Hans Muller recalled passing through a Kansas town and staring at the window of a grocery store. "There was more meat hanging there," he wrote, "than in all of Hamburg in a month. I thought I was dreaming." The shop windows gleamed with canned goods, flowers stacked in pyramids, fruit in baskets so full the weight bent their handles. He thought of his sister's letters from Cologne, bread lines stretching for hours, ration cards running dry, children fainting in school. The contrast gnawed at him more than hunger ever had. For many Americans, the sight of German POWs in their towns was equally surreal. Eleanor Price remembered her mother insisting on giving 2 young prisoners bread and jam while they worked near the churchyard. "They looked so thin," she said. "My mother could not turn them away." Some farmers went further, inviting prisoners to rest in the shade and share lemonade. To the prisoners, this kindness was almost unbearable. One Bavarian muttered, "We expected stones thrown at us, curses shouted. Instead, we are offered kindness. It makes no sense." The statistics underline the scale. By 1945, over 200,000 German prisoners were employed across the American interior, providing more than 45 million man-days of labor. They dug irrigation ditches, built roads, and stacked lumber in sawmills. They were paid in camp script, enough to buy soap, candy, or cigarettes. Yet these tokens represented more luxury than their families at home could dream of. Suspicion lingered among some. Perhaps it was all staged, a grand illusion meant to break their spirits. But each trip outside chipped away at the doubts. They saw bakeries throwing unsold loaves into bins at closing time. They saw children licking ice cream cones on sidewalks, farmers buying new tractors, freight trains stretching so long they seemed to have no end. Even the air carried proof of abundance. Diesel, gasoline, grilled meat, fresh bread. No theater could sustain such detail. Sergeant Joe Ramirez watched the prisoners' faces from the truck bed one afternoon, as they passed fields of corn that rippled for miles. That's when it hit them, he remembered. They knew this wasn't a trick. This was just how America lived. For many Germans, these glimpses beyond the camp were more devastating than the fireworks of a July barbecue. Behind wire, abundance might still be doubted. But in American streets, prosperity was undeniable. The war might continue far away, but here, life moved forward, untouched, prosperous, and free. And as the war's end drew near, a quiet dread crept into their thoughts. One day, they would be sent back to cities in ruins, back to hunger, back to families who could scarcely imagine the world their sons had seen. By late 1945, the direction of the trains reversed. No longer carrying fresh captives into Texas or Kansas, they now bore weary prisoners back toward the Atlantic. The camps began to empty, the barbed wire rusting in the sunday. Liberty ships once again carried them across the ocean, but this time, the mood was grim. There was no mystery awaiting them in Europe, only devastation. Hans Muller stepped onto the dock at Bremerhaven and felt as though he had entered another planet. Bombed-out shells of buildings lined the waterfront. Streets were filled with rubble, windows gaped like broken teeth, and the air stank of coal smoke and hunger. It was like falling from heaven into hell, he later confessed. Only months earlier, he had eaten 3 eggs at breakfast in Texas, washed down with coffee and milk. Now, his wife and children rationed 1 egg among 4 mouths. Statistics bore out the misery. In 1946, daily civilian rations in much of occupied Germany fell below 1,000 calories, sometimes sinking to 800 inches, the British zone. Bread lines stretched for blocks, malnutrition spread among children, and the black market flourished as families bartered heirlooms for scraps of food. For men returning from America, the guilt was crushing. "I had eaten chocolate in captivity," one diarist wrote. "My children had never seen it." Yet, amid the hunger, memories lingered. Former prisoners remembered barbecues, where strangers offered them peach cobbler. They remembered payslips that bought Coca-Cola, evenings when violins played Beethoven across the wire, mornings when coffee flowed as if it were an endless stream. They remembered the paradox that America's greatest power was not cruelty, or even its factories, but its ordinary abundance. Dr. Hoffman would later tell his students, "We were defeated twice, first by their armies, then by their way of life." Historians now trace how those experiences quietly shaped post-war reconciliation. Many former POWs returned with a new respect for democracy, for fairness, for the possibility of a future built not on fear, but on trust. When West Germany began its slow climb toward recovery, the memory of life in America, its farms, its food, its freedoms, lived on in their stories. Eleanor Price, years later, reflected on it with quiet pride. Perhaps it was right that we fed them. Not just their bodies, but something in their hearts. Perhaps that made peace easier to imagine. In the end, the barbed wire came down, the camps vanished, and the men went home. Yet the lesson endured, echoing across decades. America had shown its enemies a weapon more powerful than bombs or tanks. The power of plenty, the power of freedom, the power of ordinary life lived without fear. For those who once marched into captivity expecting chains, the true shock was not defeat itself, but discovering a nation that conquered with generosity.